Heroes of Israel by William Garden Blaikie. Chapter 2. Abram's Call and Migration to Canaan. Genesis chapter 11 verses 27 to 32 and chapter 12 verses 1 to 5. The start of the Hebrew nation on its very peculiar career was unlike that of any other great nation recorded in history. Like other nations, the Hebrew had its distinguished fathers, who were to it as the heroes were to them. But the Hebrew fathers had this peculiarity: they were related to each other as father, son, and grandson. No other triad resembles that of Abram, Isaac, and Jacob. The heroes of the, quote, Iliad, end quote, Agamemnon, Achilles, and Ulysses, have no such relation. Sometimes brothers were associated in the honors of heroship, as in Indian legends Rama and Lakshmana, Krishna and Bala, and again Yudhishthira, Bhima, and Arjuna, a circumstance that may remind us of the, quote, three brothers, end quote, that figure so largely in the traditions of modern Americans on the origin of their families. But there is no other instance of a great nation sprung from three men who were the single representatives of three successive generations. The family, it is said, is the root of the state, and the best states are those which have most of the family character. The Jewish nation was designed to have much of the family character, and this peculiar feature of its ancestry contributed to this result. Necessarily, the history of the first period of the Hebrew race is the history of a family, and while every feature of family life is introduced, each member is marked by so strong an individuality as to seem designed to be a type of his species. In nearly every feature, Abram is a model father and Isaac a model son. Sarai, notwithstanding her impatient temper, is a faithful, affectionate wife who accepts her husband's role and is his attached and beloved companion to the end. Isaac is like his father in many ways, but lacks his greatness and his power. Jacob is a strange mixture of good and bad, but the good predominates at last. He is an interesting and a powerful character, and he has this remarkable fortune, that while in their youth his sons as a whole show all his bad qualities in an aggravated form, they learn, further on, to follow him in much that is good. Then, besides the relations of husband and wife, father and son, we have in this story nephews and uncles and fathers-in-law and cousins. Abram becomes a father to Lot, his fatherless nephew. Jacob falls in love with his cousin, but has no satisfaction in his father-in-law. And passing beyond the bounds of blood, we have servants of a very high order introduced as members of the family. Eliezer of Damascus is the faithful steward of Abram, and Deborah the much-loved nurse of Rebekah. But perhaps the most remarkable feature of all is the place which women occupy in this family circle. Sarai, Rebekah, and Rachel are all prominent, holding places of honor, and exercising a much more marked influence on the family life than any female in the household of Moses or David or Solomon, or indeed any other Old Testament hero. Was not this a foreshadowing of the Christian household, and an indication that under Judaism the family life generally would have been of a very high type, had not its natural development been checked by contrary influences? And this leads to the remark that the tendency to degeneration from the true type was seen actively at work in the patriarchal home. Lot is the counterpart of Abram, lured by worldliness into vice and misery. Hagar is the counterpart of Sarai, a slave concubine rather than a wife, looking only to the interests of herself and her son. Ishmael is the counterpart of Isaac, as reckless and pugnacious as Isaac is prudent and peaceable. Esau is the counterpart of Jacob, much more like the son of Ishmael than the son of Isaac. Esau's Hittite wives are the counterparts of Leah and Rachel, a grief of mind in many ways to Isaac and Rebekah. The one element wanting in the patriarchal family is sisters, and when at length a sister appears in the family of Jacob, It is not for good to herself or to others. The patriarchal family was not a poetical paradise without a tempter and without sin. It was a battlefield where good and evil were in perpetual conflict. By sifting away the more active elements of evil and bestowing a large blessing on the chosen seed, God kept the three fathers comparatively pure, and thus provided for future generations an example enshrined in their earliest traditions which always encouraged whatever was estimable and good. It is with the founder of this family that we now leave Ur of the Chaldees, as he sets out to go to the land he was afterwards to receive for his inheritance. We find two statements in Genesis respecting the emigration of Abram, to Haran in the first instance, and thereafter to Canaan. Toward the close of the 11th chapter, it is said, quote, Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his son's son, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. And they came unto Haran, and dwelt there. End quote. Again, in the beginning of chapter 12, it is said, quote, Now the Lord said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto the land which I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and be thou a blessing. End quote. Revised Version. Some have thought, and the impression at first sight is a natural one, that it was Terah that devised the emigration from Ur to Haran, and that in so doing he was prompted simply by a desire to improve the circumstances of his family. Further, that it was in Haran that the divine call came first to Abram to separate himself from his kindred and his country and his father's house, and that the removal of Abram and his household from Haran was his first act of faith, his first movement in compliance with the divine commandment, when, quote, he went out, not knowing whither he went. End quote. But a more careful examination of the 11th chapter will modify this conclusion, for it is expressly stated, verse 31, that Terah's party, quote, went forth from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan, end quote. Haran was not the destination of that emigrant band. It was only a halting place by the way. Again, in Genesis chapter 15, verse 7, it is said, quote, I am the God that brought thee out of Ur of the Chaldees, to give thee this land to inherit it. End quote. This shows that the divine plan which ended in Abram's being brought to Canaan began when he left Ur of the Chaldees, and that the same divine hand that laid hold of him there guided him all the way. It must have been in Ur, therefore, that he first received the divine command, and in the speech of Stephen before the Sanhedrin this is expressly stated, quote, The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran, and said unto him, Get thee out of thy land, and from thy kindred, and come into the land which I shall show thee. End quote. So convinced were the translators of the authorized version that this was the true view, that they threw the statement in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, into the pluperfect tense, quote, Now the Lord had said to Abram, end quote. This alteration has not been retained in the Revised Version, but that does not mean that the revisers did not hold this view. It would appear that the first part of the narrative, Genesis chapter 11, verses 31 and 32, is designed to present the transaction in the aspect in which men saw it. The other, Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 5, goes deeper and makes known how it originated, the motive by which it was prompted, and the authority to which it was due. As far as appeared to human eyes, the migration took place under the direction of Terah, Abram's father, and Abram simply appeared to act the part of a dutiful son, accompanying his father in his emigration. Perhaps, in an Oriental narrative, it would have been counted unseemly to give a secondary place to the father. Nominally, he must head the expedition. Most readers will agree with the very decided view of Calvin, quote, that Abram had been called of God before he moved a foot from his native soil, is too plain to be denied. End quote. Two questions naturally arise here, although it is not easy to answer them directly. In the first place, how came Terah, Abram's father, to take part, and apparently a prominent part, in the migration? And in the second place, how came the party to halt at Haran and remain there, as it seems likely, a considerable time, when Haran was but a station, and an out-of-the-way station too, on the way to Canaan, and no special blessings were promised to Abram there? To the former of these questions, it is natural to reply that probably Terah had been impressed by his son's convictions, and had come to share in his faith. He had renounced his early polytheism and become a worshipper of the one God. Compare Genesis chapter 31, verse 53. He had been led to associate blessing with his son, and it might be a desire to share that blessing that led him to accompany him. It was not a new thing for a father to look on his son as a channel of coming blessing. Lamech, after 182 years' experience of the toils and vicissitudes of life, when his son was born, quote, called his name Noah, saying, "This same shall comfort us concerning the work and toil of our hands, because of the ground which the Lord hath cursed." End quote. Faith in the divine blessing, as promised to some individual or race, became not uncommon in after times. Witness the faith of Rahab of Jericho in the coming exaltation of Israel. Witness the faith of Abigail in the divine promise of David, or in the New Testament, the faith of the centurion of Capernaum, or that of the Syrophoenician mother in Jesus as the fountain of healing power. Why should not Terah have believed in his son as a divine channel of blessing? It is comparatively easy for fathers to believe in a great future for their sons. Doubtless, the demeanor of Abram commended his faith in his father's eyes, and gave reality to his profession. What a happiness it would be to himself if his father entered through his instrumentality into the same blessed relation to God. And how would this react on Abram's own faith, and help to give it its wonderful firmness and tenacity? We may not be warranted to conclude absolutely that it was so, but two facts are sufficiently plain. First, that the divine call to Abram was the true cause of the migration, and second, that Terah accompanied his son. The other question, why did the party halt at Haran, is also difficult to answer. Haran was not in the direct road from Ur to Canaan, but a long way further to the south. The more direct route would have been by Damascus, through which Abram doubtless had to travel afterwards when he left Haran on his way to Canaan. The most probable answer is that God permitted the halt to be made at Haran by way of gradually training and preparing Abram for the ulterior step. In God's great operations, men are taken at first as they are, and gradually prepared for the crisis of their life. God might easily have enabled the Israelites, when they left Egypt, to advance to Canaan by the nearer route, through the land of the Philistines. But lest the hitherto untrained people should be afraid when they saw war, he led them by the way of the desert. It broke the severity of the trial for Abram to halt at Haran. Perhaps the faith and possibly the infirm condition of Terah were not equal to any further effort at that time. But having experienced God's goodness at the halfway house, Abram would be encouraged in due time to gird himself for the next stage of his pilgrimage, when he went forth to dwell among more complete strangers, quote, not knowing whither he went, end quote. There were two other companions of Abram's pilgrimage, not to be overlooked if we would realize his surroundings. These were Sarai and Lot. His attachment to Sarai was evidently of the warmest. There had been a time in his youthful history when his heart thrilled with a strange sensation for his young and beautiful relative, as his grandson Jacob's did afterwards for Rachel. Then came the happy day of union, and the linking of their lives together, sealing the union of their hearts in a fellowship of which they never tired. And best of all, their hearts were one in their deepest feelings, in their faith and in their worship. They could kneel together at the same altar and pour out their thanksgivings and confessions, their desires and their hopes, into the ear of him whom both knew as Father. Sarai is called Abram's sister, quote, the daughter of his father, but not the daughter of his mother, end quote. Genesis chapter 20, verse 12. She had been a daughter of Terah by another wife, or possibly, as Josephus says, a granddaughter of Terah and a sister of Lot. Such connections were not then regarded as beyond the circle of marriage. Lot, Abram's nephew, was probably not much younger than himself. Evidently, they were much attached. Perhaps through sympathy on Lot's part, as well as by personal conviction, Lot accepted his uncle's faith. But there was a shallowness in his character that must have made Abram anxious and uncertain how he would act in any great crisis of his life. And now the migration has begun. Michael's vision describes it. Quote, I see him, but thou canst not. With what faith? He leaves his gods, his friends, and native soil, Ur of Chaldea, passing now the ford, to Haran, after him a cumbrous train, of herds and flocks, and numerous servitude, not wandering poor, but trusting all his wealth, with God, who called him, in a land unknown. End quote. The distance from Ur to Haran is about 500 miles, and the route is along or near the banks of the Euphrates, over a plain which presented no special difficulty to the transportation either of men or cattle. Attempts have been made to trace the course of the caravan as it moved slowly along the plain, and to indicate the principal places at which it might halt in its northward career. In the space of 4,000 years, the channels of the rivers may have changed greatly, but the sites of the chief cities and the general features of the country remain the same. About 40 miles from Ur, they would arrive at Erech or Walka, a famous city, Genesis chapter 10, verse 10, possibly conspicuous even then for its huge temple of Anu. 50 miles further would bring them to Calne, Genesis chapter 10, verse 10, Amos chapter 6, verse 2. The modern Niphar, another of the ancient capitals of Chaldea, its name supposed to be formed from the name of the god Anu or Anna. After another 60 miles, they would reach Babylon, passing a little distance the huge building at Borsippa called Burz Nimrod, quote, the stages of the seven spheres, end quote, which, if it really was, quote, the Tower of Babel, end quote, would impressively remind the company of the early fruits of disobedience to God's command and defiance of his will, and strengthen them in that purpose of obedience which had carried them so far on their way. 20 miles beyond Babylon, Sepharvaim would be reached, the, quote, double city, end quote, divided by the river, afterwards to be one of the scenes of the captivity of the 10 tribes, 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 24, and to acquire a peculiar character of infamy from the cruelty of its idolatrous sacrifices, 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 31. Hitherto the pilgrims have travelled along the flat alluvial plains of Shinar, Genesis chapter 11, verse 2, but they would now strike into a more hilly or highland region, through which they would find the Euphrates rushing at a speed very different from its almost imperceptible movement in Lower Chaldea. About 200 miles northwest of Babylon, they would come on the river Chebar, long supposed to be the river on whose banks Ezekiel had his visions. But this view has been mostly given up, because this Chebar was not in Chaldea, and it is believed that Ezekiel's Chebar was a stream nearer Babylon, the name of which has not been preserved. Crossing the Chebar, the road would lead them along its banks through a green and beautiful region, bounded by a range of gentle hills, and following its western branch, they would proceed toward Haran, which, for the present, was to be the termination of their wanderings. Haran is one of those places which retain their names for centuries. It is supposed to be derived from the Akkadian language, and to mean, quote, a road, end quote, implying that it was situated on the high road from east to west, along which the stream of traffic usually passed. In Ezekiel chapter 27, verse 23, it is enumerated among the great commercial marts that dealt with Tyre. It lay in a plain of great fertility, quote, strewed at times with patches of the brightest flowers, at other times with rich and green pastures, covered with flocks of sheep and of goats feeding together, here and there a few camels, and the son or daughter of their owner tending them. The air is so fresh, the horizon so far, and man feels so free that it seems made for those whose life is to roam at pleasure, and who own allegiance to none but themselves." End quote. It would appear that the family of Nahor, the brother of Abram, who had remained at Ur when his father, brother, and nephew left it, afterwards made Haran their permanent abode. For when Rebekah directed her son Jacob where to find her relations, it was to Haran in Mesopotamia that she sent him. About 2,000 years after Abram occupied it, it acquired notoriety in Roman history as the scene of the defeat and death of the Roman general Crassus in his encounter with the Parthians. The present village is a poor place, inhabited by tribes of Bedouin, consisting of a few conical houses, like beehives in shape, clustered together at the foot of a ruined castle. Haran must have been in many ways an inviting place for settlement, but though Abram remained in it till his father's death, he resisted the temptation to make it his permanent home. Probably it was the description of it sent back to Ur that induced Nahor and his wife Milcah to migrate to it. It is certain that they prospered greatly, but they were not so strong in faith as Abram, and did not wholly renounce the idolatry of the country. See Genesis chapter 31, verse 19, etc. At his father's death, Abram was 75 years of age. His wife Sarai was childless, so that there was no apparent prospect of the fulfillment of the promise that God would make of him a great nation. It is likely that the divine call which he had received at Ur to go forth to a land that God would show him came to him a second time at Haran, urging him to go out now on the second and more perilous journey. It was now that his faith was most severely tried. The migration from Ur to Haran, to use a common phrase, had been, quote, plain sailing, end quote, for Haran could not but be well known at Ur, and the road to it was a well-frequented highway. But when he left Haran, he literally, quote, went forth, not knowing whither he went, end quote. It could only be with a shiver of heart of the natural man that he would set out from the snug home comforts of Haran into the bleak and barren desert. There was nothing but his faith in the divine promise to support him, whether he looked for a place of abode for himself and his dependents, or thought of the promise that God would make of him a great nation, or of the assurance that in him all the nations of the earth would be blessed. It would be to ascribe to Abram a superhuman steadiness to suppose that he never had any questionings, or anxieties, or fears in connection with God's promises and his own duty under them. What we know is that at decisive moments, when it was necessary to act, his faith stood firm. In the haze of distance, and under the influence of the supernatural halo that surrounds him, we are liable to forget that he was a man of like passions with ourselves. But we should try to place ourselves in his position. We need to think of men like General Charles George Gordon, or David Livingstone, or, to go further back, of devotees like St. Francis of Assisi or Joan of Arc, to understand what numberless cravings of the natural heart for ease and security and earthly enjoyment the sense of a divine call had first to encounter and overcome, and how it was only after these temptations had all been swept clean off the field that faith became so miraculously strong. Quote, "Here am I," end quote, said Gordon, quote, "a lump of clay, thou art the potter, mould me as thou in thy wisdom wilt, never mind my cries," end quote. No doubt Abram came to feel that he too was absolutely in God's hands, and was enabled to repose in perfect calmness on the divine direction. He too must have learned to say to God, quote, "Never mind my cries," end quote. But it must have cost him preliminary struggles of unknown intensity to attain to this perfect trust. The preparations had all been made. Quote, "Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their substance that they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran, and they went forth to go into the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came." End quote. He had evidently prepared in Haran, and gathered a considerable establishment, which made it all the greater trial to leave the place. His neighbours would call him a fool and a madman. It had been computed by Kitto that the possessions of Abram and Lot were at least equal to those of Job, chapter 1, verse 3. But he left nothing behind. He had not the slightest intention of ever returning. Quote, "If he had been mindful of the country from which he set out, he might have had opportunity to return," end quote. But his hopes were far higher. Quote, "He looked for the city which hath the foundations, whose builder and maker is God," end quote. Revised Version. Manners and customs changed little in these eastern countries, and a graphic writer, founding on what may be seen today, gives a lively picture of the commencement of Abram's journey. Quote, "All their substance that they had gathered is heaped high on the backs of their kneeling camels. The slaves that they had bought in Haran run along by their sides. Round about them are their flocks of sheep and goats, and the asses moving underneath the towering forms of the camels. The chief is there, amidst the stir of movement, or resting at noon within his black tent, marked out from the rest by his cloak of brilliant scarlet, by the fillet of rope which binds the loose handkerchief round his head, by the spear which he holds in his hand to guide the march and to fix the encampment. The chief's wife, the princess of the tribe, is there in her own tent, Genesis chapter 24, verse 67, to make the cakes and prepare the usual meal of milk and butter, Genesis chapter 18, verses 2 to 8. The slave or the child is ready to bring in the red lentil soup, Genesis chapter 25, verse 34, for the weary hunter, or to kill the calf for the unexpected guest. Quote, "In every aspect, except that which most concerns us, the likeness is complete between the Bedouin chief of the present day and the Bedouin chief who came from Chaldea nearly 4,000 years ago. The more we see the outward conformity of Abraham and his immediate descendants to the godless, grasping, foul-mouthed Arabs of the modern desert, the more we shall recognize the force of the religious faith which has raised them from that lower state to be the heroes and saints of their people, the spiritual fathers of European religion and civilization. The hands are the hands of the Bedouin Esau, but the voice is the voice of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the voice which still makes itself heard across deserts and continents and seas, heard wherever there is a conscience to listen, or an imagination to be pleased, or a sense of reverence left among mankind." End quote. At what time it was revealed to Abram that the land of Canaan was to be his destination, we are not informed. The knowledge of this was certainly concealed from him at first, for it was one of the trials and triumphs of his faith that he went out, quote, "not knowing whither he went." End quote. But when he left Haran, the direction in which he was to proceed, at the very least, must have been made known to him. He moved in a southwesterly direction into the bare and lonely desert. It was probably impossible for him to take a straight line through the heart of the desert to Damascus, for no Tadmor, Palmyra, had yet been built as a halfway house, and it is likely that he would pass along the northern frontier. There is much significance in the fact that on leaving Haran his first march was into the desert, for the desert has often played a prominent part in the pilgrimages of God's people. The first march of Abram's descendants when they left Egypt was through another desert, where, instead of a few weeks, unbelief kept them for 40 years. It was in the wilderness that David was taught the art of ruling and enabled to establish a great kingdom in after years. When the divine son of Abram had been invested with his sublime commission by the Holy Ghost, he was led up immediately of the same Spirit into the wilderness. Elijah had to be reanimated for new service in the desert of Sinai, and Paul prepared for his apostleship in some lonely part, perhaps the same part, of Arabia. And in a time yet coming, when the long faithless bride, she whose name has sunk from, quote, Israel, unquote, to, quote, Jezreel, unquote, is to be brought back in deep penitence to her long-suffering husband, the way of her return is to be through the desert. Quote, "I will allure her into the wilderness, and there will I speak comfortably to her." End quote. Hosea chapter 2, verse 14. The wilderness, as all devout travellers tell us, while it produces a vivid sense of loneliness and dependence, draws the true heart upward to God. Abram was now preparing to lay the foundations of an empire compared with which that of Alexander or of Caesar would be but trifling and ephemeral. He was about to found a nation and a religion having as its cornerstone the unity and all-sufficiency of God, the only foundation on which either a religion or a nation can rest securely. He was entrusted with the administration of the one great force that, by bringing man into fellowship with God, would elevate and purify his nature, and instead of a wild savage or a selfish tyrant, make him a saint and a hero. For such a purpose, an inflexible faith in God was needed, a faith that no temptation could shake, and the experience of the lonely wilderness, where, alone with God, he and all his company were in manifest dependence upon him, was a fitting discipline for the supreme attainment. After skirting a long and weary desert, Abram would at last reach Damascus, which, even then, with its flowing streams and fruitful orchards, was a place of importance, and from which he seems to have obtained Eliezer, the servant who became the steward of his house, Genesis chapter 15, verse 2. Josephus, on the authority of a historian, Nicolaus of Damascus, says that, quote, Abraham reigned at Damascus, being a foreigner who came with an army out of the land above Babylon, called the land of the Chaldeans. After a time he rose up and removed to Canaan, end quote. Josephus adds that there was a village in the suburbs of Damascus named after him, quote, the habitation of Abraham, end quote. There is no probability in the tradition of his reigning in Damascus. Certainly he brought no army, and the purpose of his pilgrimage would never have allowed him to play the king. As Josephus makes no mention of the stay in Haran, it is likely that the residence in Damascus was substituted for it, while the idea of his reigning may be just an exaggeration of the place of preeminence which he held in the former community. Leaving Damascus, Abram would proceed by one of the ordinary caravan routes that passed, as they still pass, through Palestine to Egypt. It is likely that he would reach the land of Canaan on its northern frontier, and get his first view from some of the northern heights in the Lebanon, either on the east or the west side of the Jordan. At whatever point he crossed the stream, he would feel that a new chapter of his life had begun. This was the land that God had promised to his seed. This was to be the scene of those blessings that God had promised to him. It was from this center that the precious influence would go forth which would verify those marvelous words, quote, in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed, end quote. How would Abram's heart thrill when he set foot on the further bank of the Jordan and actually stood in the land of promise? With what keen and sparkling eyes would he and Sarai gaze on every side, filling their eyes with the goodly prospect, and exclaiming, quote, the land of our pilgrimage, and the home of our children to be, end quote.